Good evening. Thanks for being here. Whenever I speak, I begin by telling a joke. I'm a native of Hungary. I have an accent. And if you don't laugh at my joke, I know that you don't understand me. And I keep telling jokes until you laugh. If you don't understand my joke, I stop telling jokes and I go on and talk about my subject. Tonight's subject is the Lincoln Enigma, the title of my newest book. But the joke I like to tell is a joke Lincoln told. It was about a man who would go to church each Sunday and always show up late and shuffle up into first row, sit down, and fall asleep. And by the time the sermon would start, the man would start snoring. And it seemed the louder the preacher would speak, the louder he would snore. And the preacher didn't quite know how to handle it. It gone on week after week after week, until one day, again it happened. The service starts, man comes in late, sits down up front, falls asleep. The sermon comes, he starts snoring loud. So in the middle of the sermon, the preacher stopped. In a quiet voice, he said, "All of you who are going to go to heaven, please stand up." Everybody stood up, except the man sleeping up front. And then he said, "Sit down." Everybody sat down. Then at the top of his lungs, he yelled out and said, "And all of you who are going to go to hell, stand up." Well, man jumps up. He looks around. Nobody standing. He says, "Preacher, I don't know what we are voting on, but only you and I are for it." Well, all right, I guess my accent passes muster, so I'm going to continue. And I will tell another joke, though this does not come from Abraham Lincoln. It deals with the subject of my talk today, and I'm going to use a big word, context. To understand history, to understand Lincoln, you got to put him in context. You got to put him in his own time. The worst mistake we make is we take people from the 1860s, put them in our time, and think that they act or live the way we do. And that's not how it is. So let me tell my joke to make the point. It's about this farmer Mr. Jones, who's sitting and testifying in court. And the opposing lawyer asks him, "Now, did you or did you not say, Mr. Jones, after that accident, that you were not in pain, that you were not hurt?" So Jones starts up and says, "Well, it was like this. I was going to go to market, and I hitched up my wagon, I hitched up my mule, Sally, and it was a beautiful day, and the sun was shining. I was whistling to myself, feeling so good." The lawyer interrupts. "Mr. Jones, we have no time for this. We don't have all day. Yes or no? Did you say or did you not say after the accident you were not in pain?" So he starts up again. "It was a beautiful day. I was going to go to market. I hitched up my mule, Sally," and on and on. Lawyer interrupts. "Mr. Jones, yes or no? Did you or did you not say that you were not in pain after the accident?" Well, the judge interrupts and says, "Mr. Jones is an old man. Let him tell his story." So he starts up again. "It was a beautiful day. I gone to market. I was whistling to myself. My mule was pulling the wagon. It was full of pumpkins. I was going to make some money. And all of a sudden, there's this big bang, a noise. A big old Cadillac hits me from behind. I fall into the ditch on the side of the road. The pumpkins are all over the place. And there's my mule Sally down on the road bleeding. And this big man comes out of the Cadillac and walks up to my mule and says, "Oh my God, this mule is in pain." He takes out a gun and shoots her. And then he comes up to me and says, "Are you in pain?" Well, thank you. There's a point to the story. If we take people out of their own times, out of their own context, we falsify history, we end up with all kinds of nonsense. All of you have seen many pictures of Abraham Lincoln. Honest Abe was a humble man, but he did take 80 pictures during his presidential years. Jeff Davis found time only for 2. But I'm going to show you a picture of Abraham Lincoln you have not seen unless you saw it on the web, on the internet. Can you see it? And actually, there's a point to this picture. This Abraham Lincoln is a gay man. He is a gay icon. So now I'm going to get controversial here for you folks. A lot of people claim that Abraham Lincoln was gay and produce all kinds of evidence. And I'll give you the best evidence that is produced, and that is that he slept in the same bed for 3 years as his best friend Joshua Speed in Illinois. And that's a plain old fact. Lincoln walked into town, had no money, no place to stay at, met Joshua Speed. They became best of friends. They shared the same bed for 3 years. You tell that today to people and they'll say, well, gosh, he was a funny guy. What did he do? He was gay, perhaps. Well, I suppose if an adult male in the year 2001 shares a bed with somebody else for 3 years, it has sexual implications. It did not have those implications in the year 1836, or 1840 or 1860. My accent comes in hand, actually. I grew up in Hungary until I was 16 years old. It was a somewhat poor society. Sometimes people shared beds. Anybody familiar with the history of poor societies knows that people shared beds. It was common as can be in the mid-19th century. As a lawyer, Lincoln went from place to place, from town to town, following the judge. He never had a bed to himself. 2 men slept to a bed. The only person who got a bed by himself was the judge, Judge Davis, and he was 300 pounds. Anybody slept with him didn't sleep, fell out of bed. Well, you all know that the main speaker at Gettysburg was not Abraham Lincoln, but Edward Everett. He spoke for 2 hours, and that's as it should have been because people wanted him to speak for a long time. But the point I like to make is that where he stayed at night, since we're talking about Lincoln's sleeping habits. He stayed at the Wills house in the center of town. That's a big house, but there were about 37 guests. Jim Getty, you might know better. There were a lot of guests, about 3 dozen guests in that house. Well, there are no 3 dozen beds in that house. In fact, nobody got a bed to himself but Abraham Lincoln. I guess that time, by then he was president, so he rated a bed to himself, and Edward Everett, the main speaker. But as it turned out, the governor of Pennsylvania was also invited to stay at the house, and he didn't show up until 11 o'clock at night. And all the beds were taken except, at least doubled up and more, except Mr. Everett's and Mr. Lincoln's. Lawyer Wills, Mr. Wills, Judge Wills, the host, didn't dare to suggest the president sleep with the governor of Pennsylvania, so he said Mr. Everett should. Well, Mr. Everett was 69 years old. He had had a stroke. He had a bladder problem. He didn't like the idea at all.